May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be aligned with your love, O God, our strength, our courage, and our freedom. Amen. St. Francis Day is next Friday, October 4. We are celebrating Francis's life and values today here at All Saints, and at 9 o'clock we had the blessing of the animals. It was amazing to have what seemed like more than 300 pets bring their parishioners to church and to process down the central aisle and through, and then sit outside for this sermon, followed by communion and the blessing of each animal, and through that blessing, the blessing of the worshipers who brought the animals, and through those blessings, blessing of the world. All of this is appropriate on many levels. First, St. Francis, who's the most popular saint after Mary, the mother of Jesus, is the patron saint of animals for several reasons, including a story about his taming a wolf who was destroying life in the village of Gubbio in Italy. And the legend tells that in the city of Gubbio, where Francis lived for some time, there was a wolf terrifying and ferocious who devoured men as well as animals. And Francis had compassion on the townsfolk, and so he went up into the hills to find the wolf. Soon, fear of the animal had caused all his companions to flee, though the saint pressed on, according to the legend. When he found the wolf, he made the sign of the cross and commanded the wolf to come to him and to hurt him no more. Miraculously, the wolf closed his jaws and lay down at the feet of St. Francis. Brother Wolf, you do much harm in these parts, and you've done great evil, said Francis. All these people accuse you and curse you, but Brother Wolf, I would like to make peace between you and the people. Then Francis led the wolf into the town and, surrounded by startled citizens, made a pact between the citizens and the wolf. Because the wolf had done evil, because he was hungry, the townsfolk were to feed the wolf regularly, and in return the wolf would no longer prey upon them or their flocks. And in this manner, Gubbio was freed from the menace of the predator. Francis even made a pact on behalf of the town dogs that they would not bother the wolf again. Finally, to show the townspeople that they would not be harmed, Francis blessed the wolf, hence the blessing of the animals. May, in what I have been praying for recently this past week, in this new springtime of diplomacy that seems to have broken out in our world, may our brothers Vladimir Putin and Barack Obama and Hassan Rouhani, the new president of Iran, and Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, be infused with the spirit of negotiation that St. Francis exhibited between the wolf and the people. Another legend has Francis preaching to a flock of birds who gathered around him one day, and they didn't move away. So statues of St. Francis always have a bird nestled on his arm or hand. All of this, of course, is in contrast to this morning's gospel lesson, where Dives, the rich man, was chillingly indifferent to the poor beggar who had sores on him, begging at the rich man's gate. When Francis saw poverty, when Francis saw those who were sick Rather than become indifferent to their plight, he identified with them. He kissed lepers. He lived with them. He voluntarily became poor and begged himself. It would be said that Francis was different, to be sure, but not indifferent. And that is the call for every one of us, to be different, but not indifferent. There's a great Franciscan priest many of us here love to read and learn from, Richard Rohr. He writes about his father Francis. He says, "Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful news, sisters and brothers, that you and I come to God not because of our perfection, but by our imperfection? That gives all of us an equal chance and utterly levels the human playing field. No pretending or denying is helpful any longer. Deep within us lives both a leper and a wolf, both of which we are shamed and afraid of. In Franciscan lore, they are our inner imperfections." Francis embraced the leper and called it his moment of conversion. Later, Francis tamed the wolf that was ravaging the countryside of Gubbio. The stories, Rohr says, did happen historically, but first of all, they must have happened in Francis's soul. Our inner life, our emotional life, our prayer life is where we first do our battles, and then we are prepared for our outer life conflicts. It is on the inside of us that lepers and wolves first live. And if we haven't been able to kiss many lepers in the world, if we haven't been able to tame many wolves in the outer world, it's probably because we haven't, first of all, made friends with our own leprosy and the ferocious wolf within each of us. They are always there in some form, waiting to be tamed and needing to be forgiven. St. Francis is also the patron saint of the environment. In his famous canticle, which we sang as we entered the church just now, he calls the sun his brother, the moon his sister, the earth his mother, the wind and water and death his siblings. He referred to his chronic illnesses as his sisters. For Francis, every part of the biosphere was his relative. Francis was very different, but never indifferent. Way ahead of his time. He knew, believed, and practiced a story, a narrative that he held within himself. That story says that we are all interdependent. Every microbe, stone, breeze, the climate, animal, insect, every human being, we are all a part of God's family. I recently saw an amazing TED Talk that Jane Olson sent me of Jeremy Rifkin speaking of these things that had been discovered in our brains called mirror neurons, and a new narrative that's coming from that discovery about our brains. And our friend David Corton, the great economist, has been speaking about our needing a new narrative by which to save human life and the life of the planet. I believe that practicing the habit of truth means that you and I must constantly be aware of the narratives or stories or myths by which we have shaped our lives. We must evaluate those narratives according to whether they are toxic or generative, life-threatening or life-enhancing. This morning we see two conflicting narratives polarizing Washington, D.C. as Congress is threatening to shut down all but the essential aspects of our federal life in order to cancel out or replace a healthcare system that would give healthcare access to those without, including those who languish outside the gates of Dives in an economic system that creates a bigger gap between rich and poor every day. In this TED Talk about mirror neurons, we are reminded that you and I are really hardwired to care for one another, to have empathy for one another. These neurons in our brains are the cause of that phenomenon that when you see a spider creeping up someone's arm, you feel a creepy crawly going up your arm. When someone hits their thumb with a hammer, you wince in empathy with them. That means that to be true to ourselves, we are hardwired not to be indifferent. And as a child develops, their sense of selfhood also develops, and selfhood goes together with empathic development. Increase one's selfhood, increase their empathic development. We actually are homo empathicus. And in this TED Talk, it showed that consciousness has changed over the course of history. When we lived, we human beings, in forager-hunter times, communications determined the reach of our empathy. We could only empathize with those we could shout to and be heard by. So the tribe on the other side of the mountain was the alien other for whom we didn't have empathy because there was no communication with them. Empathy only extended to blood ties. And then we developed the hydraulic agricultural civilization. We detribalized and began associations with everyone in our religion, which was a theological leap in our consciousness and our empathy. All Jews saw other Jews as part of their group and began to empathize with all other Jews. Christians saw all other Christians as extended family. Muslims the same. And then when we get to the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, the next extension comes about as a result of markets. And we have this next fiction called the nation state. And the Brits started seeing everyone in Britain as extended family, the Germans the same, Americans the same, and this allowed new loyalties based on complex energy communication revolutions, based on the annihilation of time and space. So if we have evolved from loyalties based on blood ties, to loyalties based on religious ties, to loyalties based on national ties, to loyalties based on complex communication ties, it is possible to create empathic loyalties for everything in the entire biosphere. One single race writ large in a single biosphere. No need to stop at the nation-state identity. No longer just ideologically based or religious based or tribal based or family based empathies. This is where St. Francis was centuries ago. But now we have the technology and the communications abilities to extend the central nervous system so that we think viscerally for the entire biospheric family. The amazing thing about the saints is that their contemplative life accelerated the development of their consciousness so that St. Francis can, in the 12th century, live out of a narrative that in the 21st century we are just now envisioning. The human race is the human family. In fact, everything in the entire biosphere, and in fact the universe, all related, brother suns, sister moons, cousin galaxies. The evolution of our changing consciousness has been that you and I are wired to become empathic, not indifferent. Not only for those we see and those who are our kind, but for the entire human family and all creatures, great and small, in creation and in the entire biosphere and the universe. If you and I can do this, write and live out of a new narrative, we will literally be able to save our species and save our planet. Empathy is what allows us to stretch our sensibility with one another. To empathize is to civilize. To civilize is to empathize. We need to be different, but not indifferent. Now, you can override your empathic neurons if you've got a bad religion. If you've got a toxic religion or a toxic ideology, or if you can't see anything but your desire to get money. Wendell Berry has written, throughout the 500 years since Columbus's first landfall in the Bahamas, the Christian evangelist has walked beside the conqueror and the merchant, too often blandly assuming that his cause was the same as theirs. Christian organizations to this day remain largely indifferent to the rape and plunder of the world and of its traditional cultures. It is hardly too much to say that most Christian organizations are as happily indifferent as most industrial organizations to the ecological, cultural, and religious implications of industrial economics. The certified Christian seems just as likely as anyone else to join the military-industrial conspiracy to murder creation. What an indictment on Christianity. No wonder a future bride in my office for premarital counseling last week said, "Can we in our wedding reduce all the Christian stuff? I'm not so comfortable with Christianity." Why? Because Christianity can be used to make us indifferent. This summer I led a retreat in Mississippi, and I was having a conversation with another priest. We were talking about our adult children and whether or not they were going to church. They'd been raised in the church, but were they going to church now? And this priest said to me, "My kids aren't going to church because the church friggin' lied to them about God being violent instead of grace-filled, about everybody being included instead of only the white males being the best at the top," and on and on. One of the mystical visions that St. Francis had was in a church in San Damiano. He was sitting in the church that was shabby and disrepair, praying, contemplating before a crucifix. He heard the words of Jesus come to him, "Francis, rebuild my church." And Francis thought that Jesus was talking literally about that little church that he was sitting in. And so he started rebuilding it. But actually, Francis came to learn that Jesus was talking about all of the Christian narrative, which was so screwed up at that time that Francis helped offer an alternative to. Those same words are coming to you and me in the 21st century, my sisters and brothers. Christianity has been so hijacked by those who are indifferent to Jesus' inclusion, compassion, and solidarity with the poor, the outcast, the ill, the oppressed, and the environment choking on our despoiling it, that Jesus often doesn't recognize Christianity as having to do with his values at all. May the spirit of St. Francis and the spirit of Christ help you and me and all saints redefine Christianity for our time. Rebuild Christ's church so that it is no longer indifferent. Rebuild and reconstruct a theology of Jesus and St. Francis so that we are not so focused on heaven that we are not any earthly good. Amen.